This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform for building a beautiful website and growing your online presence. More on them a bit later. He inherited a small investigative bureau and turned it into the largest, most pervasive, and most efficient federal law enforcement agency. Like an unshakable colossus, he cast his shadow over the darkest and most momentous times of American history. The World Wars, the Red Scares, the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the mysterious assassinations of the 1960s. His name was, of course, J. Edgar Hoover, the legendary and controversial director of the FBI. John Edgar Hoover was born on the 1st of January 1895. From birth, everything pointed to a manifest destiny within civil service. To start with, he was born in Washington, D.C. and came from a family who had served the federal government for generations. His father, Dickerson Naylor Hoover, worked for the U.S. Coast Survey Office, in fact. But the real moral guide of the family was his mother, Annie. J. Edgar would remain extremely close to her, living in the same house of Seward Square until her death in 1938. J proved from the start that he had an iron will and a competitive streak. Marred by a stuttering problem in his high school years, he overcame it by joining the debate team and developing an extremely quick speech pattern. After graduation, J. Edgar enrolled at George Washington University Law School in October of 1913. He attended night classes as during the day he was busy working at the Library of Congress. J. Edgar was posted within the Orders Department in charge of acquiring books and manuscripts for the library's collection. But what he really excelled at was sorting, filing, and cataloging material, organizing and cross-referencing complex information, in other words. Nobody could imagine it at the time, but young Hoover was learning the foundations of what would become one of the FBI's most efficient weapons: its filing system. After a successful period with the library, J. Edgar finished law school in 1917. That very April, the US joined World War I against the Central Empires and was at the right age to join the other doughboys headed for the front in France. But Hoover would not be facing the troops of the Kaiser, as he had already gotten a draft-exempt position with the Department of Justice on the 26th of July 1917. Critics speculate this was a calculated move to avoid the trenches, but it is also likely that young Hoover had to take the job to provide for his family. His dad, Dickerson, who suffered from a mental illness, had been forced out of the job without a pension that very year. Hoover may have found himself at the Department of Justice out of necessity or convenience, but he absolutely excelled at the job. In November of 1918, he was named assistant to the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, and by 1919, he was leading the department's General Intelligence Division. Those were the years of the first Red Scare, the period in which US institutions feared that anarchists and communists may attempt to overthrow the government. Palmer's enmity against subversive movements was reciprocated. In June of 1919, an anarchist group bombed his home. Palmer was unscathed, but he was seething. The Attorney General launched a campaign against all radicals, and he appointed his protege Hoover to lead the newly formed Radical Division of the Justice Department. In January and February of 1920, barely 25 years of age, Hoover organized a series of raids against suspected or confirmed left-wing activists. Only on one occasion, he personally led in the field such actions, the roundup of an Italian anarchist group in Paterson, New Jersey. Hoover clearly impressed his superiors by displaying remarkable organizational skills and determination at a very young age. But the so-called Palmer raids became known because of the blatant disregard for the basic rights of those involved. Hoover acted without any search or arrest warrants. 556 suspects were deported with scarce evidence of subversive activity. The young head of the Radical Division also targeted and spied on the lawyers defending these suspects. One of these, whom he defined as the most dangerous man in the United States, was Felix Frankfurter, who later became a Supreme Court justice. The draconian methods applied in the Palmer raids gave ammunition to the political rivals of the Attorney General. They forced Palmer to resign, but Hoover's reputation remained unscathed. He continued climbing through the ranks of the Department of Justice. The Intelligence Division was absorbed by the department's Bureau of Investigation, or BOI, in 1921, and J. Edgar was appointed assistant director. The BOI was in terrible shape. It was a small investigative office staffed by political appointees with no policing experience, relying on an outdated and disorganized filing system. That's where Hoover's reforms kicked off. Capitalizing on his experience as a librarian, the young assistant director revolutionized the indexing system, allowing his agents to quickly locate and correlate vital information. His efforts were noticed at government level. On May 10, 1924, Attorney General Harlan Fiske Stone promoted Hoover to the role of director of the BOI. Now completely in charge, the ambitious civil servant continued his overhaul of the bureau. The next step was to reform recruitment and training principles. The director no longer tolerated political nepotism and set out to design the blueprint for the G-men, the heroic government men who upheld federal law. Hoover's ideal candidate had to be male, white, preferably of WASP background, college educated, better if in law and accounting, clean-shaven, smartly dressed, polite, cool under every circumstance, and that's why the director would dismiss applicants with sweaty palms. Most of all, future agents had to be morally irreprehensible. They had to abstain from drink, tobacco, gambling, and romantic and sexual liaisons. Would-be agents went through a rigorous training school, which emphasized both intellectual and physical aspects of policing. Trainees were educated in the latest investigative procedures and technologies, for example, the use of an enormous, well-organized database of fingerprints, another innovation imposed by Hoover. Later known as the Identification Division, it would eventually offer access to the prints of 159 million people. But rookie agents had to also be men of action and were trained in driving, shooting, and unarmed combat. Hoover's small army was now poised to tackle what he had identified as the greatest threat in the era of prohibition: bootleggers, booze smugglers, and gangsters, already romanticized by Hollywood and popular culture. It would be natural to assume that the BOI would go after Cosa Nostra and similar outfits, but throughout most of his career, Director Hoover would dismiss this organized crime. Initially, he outright denied the existence of the mafia. Later, he claimed that crime syndicates were a matter for local rather than federal law enforcement. Critics have obviously speculated that Hoover may have been in the pockets of real-life godfathers. The truth is that the director was a fine strategist who wanted to bring his organization to the spotlight and build a long-lasting image of efficiency. To do this, he cultivated a friendship with reporter Courtney Riley Cooper. The author shared Hoover's love of law and order and happily helped him by writing a series of articles and books praising the Bureau. But image was not all that mattered. Hoover also wanted tangible, immediate results. What he wanted was for his men's arrests to result in a 95% conviction rate. Could he achieve that by taking on the mob? No. Not a chance. Organized crime was too much of a formidable adversary, and arresting a mafioso would seldom result in a conviction. So, the best way to score early victories was to focus on individual bandits or small gangs, especially bank robbers operating in the Midwest. One of the Bureau's early successes was the arrest of robber and prison escapee Frank Nash on June 16, 1933. A team of 4 special agents and 3 local policemen were escorting the criminal to prison in Kansas City, Missouri, when they were ambushed by Nash's accomplices. The attack lasted only 30 seconds, half a minute of concentrated Tommy gun fire, which killed 1 agent and 3 police officers. Nash also died in the attack. Hoover went on a rampage, ordering a crackdown against the most notorious criminals of the age. Legendary gangsters, feared and revered by the public, fell in rapid succession to the bullets of the G-Men: Ma Barker, Machine Gun Kelly, John Dillinger. Dillinger, one of the most prolific bank robbers of the age, had been tracked down and killed in Chicago on the 22nd of July 1934 by Special Agent Mel Purvis. The G-Man became a national hero, giving to the Bureau the coverage and ecstatic headlines that the director craved. But on this occasion, Hoover revealed his narcissistic personality. He hated the fact that it was Purvis, not he, who was the man of the hour, bathing in the limelight. The director eventually had his revenge. Purvis was systematically bullied and pressured on the job until he had to resign from the Bureau. By July of 1935, J. Edgar Hoover was the uncontested leader of America's most efficient federal agency. Fittingly, the once small BOI received a new name: the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Around the same period, President Roosevelt expanded the brief of the FBI beyond regular criminal activities. Hoover was now called upon to investigate Japanese, German, Italian, and Soviet espionage. The director took the opportunity to create a vast network of domestic surveillance on questionable individuals whose alleged fascist or communist leanings could pose a threat to national security. These individuals were catalogued in a custodial detention list, which would grow in the following decades to include political activists, civil rights campaigners, artists, and popular culture figures. One of the first VIPs to make the list, thanks to her liberal inclinations, was the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, for whom Hoover had a personal dislike. This was an early instance of a recurring Hoover trademark, letting his personal antipathies dictate his professional actions. As the US entered World War II, the FBI ramped up its efforts in domestic counterintelligence, counter-espionage, and counter-sabotage investigations. Hoover was even asked to oversee a foreign intelligence service in the Western Hemisphere, the Special Intelligence Service, or SIS. During the war, the FBI initiated some 20,000 espionage or sabotage investigations against US or foreign individuals suspected of supporting the Axis. Approximately 1,000 of them were detained at Ellis Island, the immigrant processing station in New York. Now let me interrupt today's video for a short word from today's sponsor, Squarespace. Look, if you've ever wanted to start a website but have been put off by the thought of complicated coding, then Squarespace is perfect for you. Building an online presence, it can be daunting, but no longer is an advanced coding degree or a small fortune required in order wanted to get started. Squarespace helps you stand out with a beautiful website which you can easily build with their drag and drop tools, meaning anyone can have the website of their dreams in no time at all. Their platform provides you with powerful analytics and insights into who visits your site and how they interact with your content. Squarespace's analytics tools include page views, traffic sources, audience geography, and much more. That allows you to figure out what's drawing your audience in and then capitalize on that premium data that's provided to you all as part of your Squarespace subscription. Squarespace comes with powerful blogging tools as well, allowing you to share anything from stories, photos, and videos to simple updates for your fans or customers. Connect your socials automatically. You can connect your socials and automatically push website content to your social media channels, schedule your posts, and make your content work for you. The Squarespace members areas also allow you to make it simple and easy to monetize your content in a way that fits with your brand. Unlock a new revenue stream for your business and sell exclusive access to gated content for your most dedicated customers. You can test out their platform before making any commitments. All you need to do is go to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when ready to launch your site, go to squarespace.com/biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to today's video. Along the way, Hoover was able to extend his network of surveillance on US citizens. The end of World War II marked the beginning of Hoover's most intense period of activity. This coincided with the onset of the Cold War and the paranoia for Soviet infiltration. President Harry S. Truman had signed Executive Order 9835, initiating the Federal Employees Loyalty and Security Program. According to this program, any employees suspected of disloyalty or communist sympathies could be investigated by the FBI and dismissed from their jobs. The ever-zealous Hoover and his agents checked more than 14,000 federal staff, which resulted in 212 dismissed employees. None of them were involved in espionage. Again, this activity gave the opportunity to Hoover to further extend his surveillance on citizens across all layers of society. Truman must have regretted giving him such powers, as he later wrote, "We want no Gestapo or secret police. FBI is tending in that direction. They are dabbling in sex life scandals and plain blackmail. Edgar Hoover would give his right eye to take over, and all congressmen and senators are afraid of him." Truman had hit upon one of Hoover's obsessions: sex. The Bureau maintained files on politicians, activists, civil servants, and Hollywood royalty alike, documenting their alleged or confirmed sexual indiscretions. Now, I'm not going to delve deeper into Hoover's private life, but I should point out that the man himself was not immune from potential scandals. In 1947, he elevated his long-term protege Clyde Tolson to the rank of associate director, but their interactions may have been more than just professional. The two were inseparable, inside and outside of the office, leading to speculation that they were in a homosexual relationship and that Hoover may have indulged in cross-dressing. But what was front and center in Hoover's life at the time was his commitment to anti-communism. Hoover cooperated with the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which investigated alleged rebel activities of citizens and organizations suspected of having communist ties. The FBI director provided blacklists of suspected individuals, which he had been compiling since the 1930s. Hoover also supported the crusade of Senator Joe McCarthy, who was convinced that both the Department of State and the armed forces had been infiltrated by the Communist Party. This campaign frequently misfired, and Hoover's files led to many unfounded allegations. Innocent individuals were investigated or prosecuted simply because of their tenuous association with communist ideology or socialist countries. A lesser-known anti-Soviet plan of the FBI director was Operation Washtub, initially conceived by the Air Force's Office of Special Investigations, or OSI. The OSI had realized that Alaska was only a few miles away from Siberia. What if Comrade Stalin and a few mates from the Red Army invaded there? How about creating a resistance movement of sleeper agents prior to the invasion? FBI Special Agent John Williams in Anchorage, Alaska, was not impressed with the plan, but in June of 1950, Hoover overruled him. Williams was ordered to start building an Alaskan stay-behind network. And so it was that the FBI and OSI recruited and trained 100 cells of 5 to 7 operatives with orders to initiate guerrilla actions after a potential Red Army invasion. They had access to caches of goodies which included explosive firearms, garrots, and loads of canned food, because apparently you can't set fire to a Soviet tank on an empty stomach. Recruits had to be middle-aged civilians, preferably with extreme survival skills. A memo from the OSI to the FBI describes the ideal washtub recruit in Anchorage. He is an amateur radio operator, he is licensed as a hunting and fishing guide, and well-versed in the art of survival. He is a pilot of small aircraft, and possessed of sufficient physical courage, as is indicated by his offer to guide a party which was to have hunted Kodiak bear, armed with only bow and arrow. Sounds like a bit of a badass, but wouldn't the Soviets immediately round up a guy like that? Well, that would have actually been unlikely, as the memo clarifies he has only one arm, and it is felt that he would not benefit the enemy in any Labour battalion. Well, that settles it. The Soviet invasion, of course, never materialized. However, the maintenance costs did. The FBI and OSI racked up an annual bill of at least $21 million in today's money until they terminated Operation Washtub in 1959. Based on this account, it sounds as though Hoover and his men had been completely blinded by paranoia, leading to unfruitful and costly efforts to fight a non-existing enemy. But that would be unfair, as the concern about communist espionage was justified. This was confirmed by one of Hoover's most resounding successes, the arrest of a network of confirmed Soviet moles stealing secrets on the American nuclear warfare program. Ringleaders Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed on June 19, 1953. In 1956, Director Hoover launched a program that would forever mark his legacy, the Counterintelligence Program, or Cointelpro. This was a covert operation exposed only in March of 1971, when the self-appointed Citizens Commission to investigate the FBI broke into an FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania, and stole confidential files. The break-in revealed the extent of Cointelpro. The FBI used extra-legal means to discredit, harass, undermine, and dismantle organizations considered subversive to U.S. political stability. Hoover's targets included political organizations like the Communist Party USA, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, and the American Indian Movement. A great deal of attention was also reserved for civil rights movements such as the Black Panther Party and Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And segregationists were not immune either, as the Ku Klux Klan was in the FBI sights too. Cointelpro was rather limited in scope, accounting for 0.2% of the FBI's workload over a 15-year period. Most projects involved agents writing anonymous letters to create enmity amongst two factions. So in language we use today, they were essentially creating false accounts just to troll people. An example of this is Operation Hoodwink, which was active from the fall of 1966 to July 1968. FBI agents under alias wrote to left-wing publications criticizing the practice of loan sharking or other activities associated with the Italian mafia. Their plan was to set Cosa Nostra and other syndicates against the Communist Party. The New York office of the Bureau eventually convinced Hoover to abandon the operation, as Hoodwink had not generated any tangible results. A similar approach did have some violent consequences when applied to the Black Panthers Party. Of the 295 documented actions taken by Cointelpro to disrupt African American activism, 233 were directed against the Black Panther Party. Its co-founder, Huey P. Newton, argued in his doctoral thesis that Hoover used false letters and documents to create discord between the Black Panthers and other groups such as the United Slaves. According to Newton, this rift may have escalated into the murders of Black Panther members Al Prentice, Bunchy Carter, and John Huggins, who were shot down at the University of California on the 17th of January 1969. Later that year, the FBI struck again against the Panthers. According to a 1976 Senate report, intelligence supplied to the Chicago police led to the 4th of December raid against Fred Hampton, a local leader of the Panthers. The FBI informants may have caused the police to intervene with unjustified, disproportionate force. Officers fired 98 rounds, which killed Hampton and his associate Mark Clark and wounded 4 others. A separate commission of inquiry concluded that there is cause to believe that Fred Hampton was shot by officers while lying on his bed. Before turning his attention to the Black Panther Party, Hoover had developed an obsession with another civil rights activist, Martin Luther King Jr., who was suspected of communist affiliations. In January 1962, Hoover had learned that some of King's speeches had been written by Stanley Leveson, a former financier for the Communist Party. The director promptly informed Attorney General Robert Kennedy. The two men despised each other, but Kennedy authorized the bugging of Leveson's office. Later in the year, Dr. King publicly criticized the FBI's investigation of racially motivated crimes. This is when Hoover's suspicion of King as a communist sympathizer developed into a personal dislike and eventually an obsession. Hoover convinced Bob Kennedy to extend surveillance on an associate of Leveson and King's, Clarence B. Jones. In August of 1963, King stayed at Jones's place, and Hoover's wiretaps recorded something unexpected, proof of Reverend King's extramarital affairs. In October, Bob Kennedy yielded to Hoover's pressures and authorized direct surveillance on King. The FBI head assigns the investigation to Assistant Director Sullivan, who focused on documenting the activist's sex life on tape. Sullivan went as far as blackmailing King with an anonymous letter. The message included a veiled invite for the minister to commit suicide. King ignored the threat, and the FBI didn't go public with the scandal. But Hoover and King continued a feud throughout 1964. King accused Hoover of siding with segregationists, while Hoover replied by calling him the most notorious liar in the country and a sexual degenerate. Hoover lifted some of the pressure on King in 1965 for simple admin reasons. When the Kings moved to a new house, the FBI director did not authorize the bugging of the new place. Apparently, he wanted to cut down on the number of wiretaps. But in February and April of 1967, Dr. King denounced the war in Vietnam. This alienated the Johnson administration's support and spurred Hoover to attack again. His Cointelpro agents orchestrated a press campaign to discredit the Reverend and sabotage King's fundraising efforts. His civil rights organization, the SCLC, was forced to lay off much of its staff. Less than 1 year later, on the 4th of April 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. Hoover decreed the investigation on the shooting as a top priority. Thanks to the FBI's extensive fingerprint database, the murderer was identified as James Earl Ray, arrested on the 8th of June after an international manhunt. So, a victory for justice with Hoover at the helm. Well, not according to Ray's attorney, William F. Pepper. His theory is that Dr. King's assassination was part of a large conspiracy masterminded by Hoover and his deputy Clyde Tolson. But look out for our episodes on Martin Luther King and James Earl Ray for more details on the relationship between the FBI and the civil rights movement. Based on what we've discussed so far, one may argue that Hoover was a supporter of segregation. But don't forget that another one of his key targets was the KKK. A branch of Cointelpro named White Hate was launched in September 1964 to strike at the KKK, whom Hoover denounced as cowardly jackals. To this end, the FBI disseminated intelligence on KKK activities to journalists and politicians, driving public opinion against the Klan. In a contorted yet effective move, Hoover fed the notion that the KKK rallies negatively affected investment decisions by military contractors, thus hindering America's war effort in Vietnam. Conclusion: the Klan was an anti-American organization, unwittingly favoring the communist cause. Special agents also employed informants and insiders to circulate discrediting information about the Klan leaders among members, inculcating disillusionment and driving resignations from local chapters. Evidence of embezzlement was very useful, of course, but even more useful was that old Hoover chestnut of sexual immorality. An example of this tactic was the campaign against J. Robert Jones, the Grand Dragon for North Carolina. The FBI distributed cartoons depicting Jones as he squandered Klan funds on extramarital affairs. The cartoonist must have been very talented, as the plan led to infighting and resignations in North Carolina. Eventually, White Hate did play a part in shifting perception of the KKK in the South. Its violence against black activists or ordinary citizens had been widely tolerated up to the early 1960s. Then, by the late 1960s, the press, public opinion, and finally also juries perceived Klansmen as anti-American extremists. Up until the citizens' break-in of 1971, Hoover and his FBI enjoyed a positive reputation with the general public. The director was hailed as the nation's defender, who led a modern detective force taking down public enemies with the help of scientific work and field action. But Hoover's enemies and some of his employers knew they'd better steer clear of him and his unorthodox extra-legal approach. That is why, when the 77-year-old died in his sleep on May 2, 1972, he left behind a controversial legacy. The very same day, President Nixon lamented his loss at a press conference. Every American, in my opinion, owes J. Edgar Hoover a great debt for building the FBI into the finest law enforcement organization in the entire world. But in private, he expressed relief that the old sucker is dead. Depending on your stance, J. Edgar Hoover may be remembered as America's top cop or as its sinister chief inquisitor. His achievements as head of the Bureau for 48 uninterrupted years are undeniable, but so is the fact that 48 years of such tremendous power concentrated into a single individual could easily become a recipe for abuse.